Hi class, in this video I'm going to introduce you to Ludwig Wittgenstein and talk about the 7 main propositions of his book, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. So, Wittgenstein was born in 1889 in Vienna, Austria, although at the time it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he died in England in 1951. And Wittgenstein is widely considered one of the most important, one of the most consequential and influential philosophers of the 20th century. Our focus in this class is going to be on his early thought. Like generally, scholars divide Wittgenstein's work into different stages or periods. There's an early period and a late period and a middle period. But our focus is going to be on the early Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein came to philosophy in a roundabout way. He was initially going to study engineering, and he wanted to work on aeroplanes, which was a hot new technology at the time. And so he left Vienna and went to England, I believe to Manchester, to study engineering. While he was studying engineering, he had to take a great deal of math courses, and this led Wittgenstein to become very interested in certain philosophical questions about the foundations of mathematics. As it happens, this was a very hot topic in philosophy at the time, and one of the leading figures in the philosophy of mathematics was working in England, and his name was Bertrand Russell. And the other main figure in this field was a German philosopher named Gottlob Frege. Wittgenstein introduced himself to both Frege and Russell, and Frege was fairly old and didn't have time to take on a new student, so Wittgenstein ended up going to Cambridge University, where he could work with Bertrand Russell on logic and the philosophy of mathematics. While he was there, Wittgenstein came to the conclusion that many of the puzzles and problems of philosophy were due to improper use of language. And so he therefore concluded that if he could figure out the nature of language and its limits, what language can and cannot do, he could either solve or eliminate most problems in philosophy. And this became his project that he worked on. While he was working on it, World War I started, and Wittgenstein returned home to the Austro-Hungarian Empire and enlisted in the army. He served at the front lines in World War I until he was captured by the opposing army and waited out the rest of the war at a prisoner of war camp in Italy. While he was in Italy in this prisoner of war camp, Wittgenstein wrote the first draft of the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, and I'll talk to you about the title of the book shortly. When the war was over and he was released back home to Vienna, he continued working on multiple drafts of the book and attempted to get it published. Because his side lost the war, there wasn't a lot of money to go around to spend on philosophy books, so he ended up having to have it published in England. This was a problem because he wrote it in German. He had to have the book translated into English by a friend of his from Cambridge, and then published in England with the German on one page, the English translation on the other, and then an introduction by Bertrand Russell to guarantee the quality of the work, since Wittgenstein was a largely unknown author. With the publication of the Tractatus, Wittgenstein felt that he had solved or eliminated all the problems of philosophy, and that there was no longer any need for him to do philosophy. So he enrolled in education courses and became a certified kindergarten teacher and taught kindergarten and elementary education for about, I want to say, 8 years in a small village in the Austrian mountains. He also spent some time working as a gardener in a monastery and designing his sister's house, but mainly he worked as an elementary school teacher. Then various things happened that lead Wittgenstein to realize that he hadn't solved all the problems of philosophy and that he needed to return to that field. But that's not what we're going to talk about. So, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus is a strange title. The German title of the book is Logische Philosophische Abhandlung, which just means something like the Logic Philosophy Handbook. But the English publisher thought that that wasn't a fancy enough title, right? That if they published it as the Logic Philosophy Handbook, it might seem like just an introductory level text. So they told him he needed to come up with a fancier title. So he and the translator decided that they would give it this title, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, because that seems very, very fancy. So there's a sense in which the title of the book is almost a joke. Probably one of the few jokes Wittgenstein ever made in his life. And the way the book is structured is like a mathematical or logical proof. So rather than being written in essay form or dialogue form or anything like that, it's written with numbered propositions. And I gave you a handout with the 7 main propositions. Now each of those propositions then has sub-propositions that I left out because I didn't want to give you the whole book. So you see there's proposition 1, and then there would be a 1.1, 1.11, 1.112, 1.113, and so on, fleshing out the meaning of those propositions. What is going on with the Tractatus? The Tractatus is trying to do 3 main things. First, it's trying to clarify and make explicit the underlying logical structure of our language. Right? He's trying to understand the deep or hidden structure of language so that we can understand how it is supposed to work. Once we understand how it is supposed to work, that will bring us to the second thing that he wants to do, which is we will be able to see when language is being used correctly and when it is being used incorrectly, which will bring us to the third thing, which is we will have sort of a border between what can be said correctly in a language and what cannot be said. So he begins with a definition of the world. Proposition 1 says, the world is everything that is the case. What does that mean? What is the case is essentially, as we find out in Proposition 2, the existence of a state of affairs. So what he's saying in Propositions 1 and 2 is that what makes up the world is not individual things, but individual things that are related to one another. A state of affairs is a relation between things. It's not that here's a pen and here's a cup and they're completely separate. The state of affairs is, say, that the pen is on the cup. What the world is made up of is not just the pen and the cup, but the relationship between the pen and the cup. So the world is not merely just things, but relationships between and amongst things. It is the job of language to represent that. In the third proposition, he says, a logical picture of facts is a thought. When I have the thought that the pen is on the cup, scholars call this his picture theory of language, that in a way, I'm using the words pen, is on, and the cup to represent this fact. So my thought, which I'm expressing in language, that the pen is on the cup, is a picture of that state of affairs. It's a representation of that state of affairs. So a logical picture of a fact is a thought. And then in the fourth main proposition, he says that a thought is a proposition with sense. What does that mean? The contrast would be a proposition without sense. To understand exactly what that means, we have to look at the fifth proposition, which says that a proposition is a truth function of an elementary proposition, and an elementary proposition is a truth function of itself. What? Ultimately, fairly easy. In order for a thought to have a sense, it has to be capable of being true or false. When I say the pen is on the cup, in this instance, it's true. If I say the pen is not on the cup, it's false. Both of those thoughts have a sense because they can be true or false. That's the truth functionality of it. What is it about saying the pen is on the cup that makes it capable of being true or false? Well, rewind a little bit to the earlier propositions, and we see that it's because it's a picture of a state of affairs. So the point that Wittgenstein is getting at is that sentences that are meaningful, that have a sense, as opposed to being senseless, are sentences that picture or describe a state of affairs in the world. And sentences that do not picture or describe a state of affairs in the world are, in the strict sense, senseless. So what does that mean? Right? Wittgenstein is beginning to draw a boundary between what we can say and what can have meaning or sense, and then what, if we say it, is senseless and has no real meaning. In the latter part of the Tractatus, he mentions certain things that would have no meaning. So there are two ways that something can be senseless in Wittgenstein. I like to think of it as you can be senseless by going through the roof or through the basement. Senselessness in the basement is when you're just talking nonsense. Like, if I say, numbers smell furiously sheep, that's senseless because I completely garbled the rules of language, right? My grammar is all awful. No one knows what that means. That's being senseless through the basement. Wittgenstein's not really interested in that because it's fairly obvious that it's senseless. What he's more interested in are senselessness through the roof. And he would claim that many of the big questions in philosophy and religion are senseless, but again, like through the roof. What does that mean? He would claim that they're senseless not because they are stupid, but because they are too elevated. Because remember, we can only meaningfully talk about things in the world. So whenever we want to talk about things that are outside the world, we're going to run into difficulties. So Wittgenstein says, when you want to talk about the soul, that's not a thing in the world the way this pen is. So when I want to talk about that, I'm going to be saying something senseless. Or if I want to talk about God, God's not a thing in the world. So when I talk about God, it's going to be senseless. If I want to talk about being, just the fact that the world exists, just the existence of everything, I'm not going to be able to do that meaningfully because the existence of everything is not a state of affairs in the world, right? It's sort of a meta question about why are there states of affairs at all. So when I start asking questions like that, I'm going to be senseless. And so Wittgenstein says there's all these questions. If I ask about the meaning of life, senseless. If I ask about what is beauty, senseless. If I ask about any of these big questions, it's senseless. And this is where Wittgenstein is consistently misinterpreted, even by his friends like Bertrand Russell. A lot of people read Wittgenstein and say, well, since he's saying this stuff is senseless, he must be saying it's not important. But that's not what he's saying. What he's saying is that these questions are the most important, but as he says in the seventh proposition, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. Which is to say, we can't talk about these things. We can't talk in a philosophic, scientific, theoretical manner about the meaning of life, about God and the soul and all of these things. So what should we do? Be silent. But for Wittgenstein, it is a respectful silence that he thinks is an improvement over just jabbering away at it, not saying anything. Right? So Wittgenstein's idea when he's talking about silence in the seventh proposition, it's the silence of reverence or the silence of respect for these questions. And there's a sense in which he thinks that, and you get this from some of his diary entries and some other writings, that one might feel the answer to these questions, but you can't explain it. So in his diaries during World War I, he's talking about faith, and the feeling of having faith is, he says, the feeling that no matter what happens, it will be okay. He says it's not the feeling that I won't get hurt, but that even if I get hurt, it'll be okay. He can feel that. He says, he can feel the presence of God, but he can't talk about it. It's not something that he can write a book about or give a scientific lecture about. And he thinks that that's the big mistake that a lot of philosophers and religious people make, is that they try to talk about these things, and then they can't because of the limits of language that he articulated, and they make it look bad. It would be better to just respect it in silence. Again, a lot of people misunderstood Wittgenstein on this. A lot of his early readers read him as if he was saying these questions are all stupid and we shouldn't pay them any heed at all, which is not his view at all. Again, they're the most important questions, but we can't answer them scientifically, so we should just be quiet and sit with them. Now, you might say, if Wittgenstein's being misinterpreted about this by his friends like Bertrand Russell and his early readers in Vienna, why didn't he correct them? Well, because he's being silent. He can't correct them because then he'd have to talk about it. So he just had to put up with this misreading. So Wittgenstein, ultimately, what's sometimes called as strict logical empiricism, is ultimately in the service of a kind of mysticism or quietism. And we'll see how this develops in the next thing we're going to look at, his lecture on ethics, which is as close as he comes to ever talking about these things, and we'll see how he handles that.